Hey guys, I, like many of you, am a YouTube addict, and I spend my time pretty much all day, every day, just watching YouTube videos. And also, like many of you, one of my favorite content creators that I've even talked about on this channel before is Man Caring Thing. He had put out a video recently about the critical drinker and masculinity, and this inspired me to create my own video about this. Now, if you have seen anything going on this channel in the recent weeks, months, maybe year, a lot of what I talk about is the intersection of storytelling, masculinity, psychology, and sociology. Because luckily, that's what I am trained in. That's what I went to school for and got my degree in. And so I think, very passionate about talking on these subjects. And because of Man Caring Thing, I felt motivated to finally speak about the critical drinker because I kind of know a lot about him and almost nothing at all. You're going to have to understand that because of how much time I've spent on YouTube. I see the critical drinker a lot, like on my main channel, I have 360,000 subscribers and I've been doing YouTube for like 8 years. And because of that, and being relatively large in the niche, I try to generally keep aware of other people who are doing similar commentary on pop fiction. And of course, you can't be on the platform without knowing who Critical Drinker is, at least if you do the type of things I do.
Man.
And every single video that I see from him is generally complaining about fiction. Now, of course, and I'm not going to look it up because I don't really care that much, I'm sure he does praise certain things. In fact, I think maybe his most recent video is a praise of something, maybe. But for the most part, I always see him bashing things. And like everything that I see him bashing always seems to be something with either a woman or a brown person in it.
Tell me, how many dumb, hapless, incompetent husbands, fathers, and boyfriends do you see constantly screwing up even the most simple household tasks and needing someone more diverse to bail them out?
Now again, it could be coincidence, I know it's not, but it could have been a coincidence that just from his thumbnails or his titles that it always seemed to be reflective of the worst communities online and the reactionary hate that they have for maybe legitimately bad fictions, but for the wrong reasons. Because again, it's not wrong to dislike a fiction, but it is wrong to dislike a fiction because someone has too dark of a skin tone for you, or maybe they have a chromosome that you don't agree with. And because of all this, I jumped at the chance to watch Man Caring Thing's video. Funny enough, I actually talked to Jake and messaged him on Twitter. I guess I'm dead naming it now. It's X. And told him that I was really actually looking forward to making another video because I'd made a previous one when he talked about AI art. And he kind of gave me his blessing. So hopefully this video doesn't suck. But the reason I wanted to talk about this topic specifically is, again, because even though I think Man Caring Thing's channel and his video on Critical Drinker did a lot of really good stuff and it was really great, please go watch it. I'll put a link in the description. It was 15 minutes long and it flew by, but there were like so many aspects that he didn't even touch upon about just like how ridiculous a lot of the Critical Drinker's arguments are and how insidious they really are for young men. And I noticed it while watching through, and I wanted to give my own 2 cents and input, again, as someone whose background is in a lot of these things and the intersections from all the things the Critical Drinker talks about. And the reason I think it's so insidious, and the reason I think it should be dissected for people who care about masculinity and how to live a proper masculine life, is because so many of the people who actually do care, I think, about men's health, men's mental standing within the modern world, how to navigate the modern world as a man, may unwittingly buy into these type of like talking points that get pushed a lot by people like Critical Drinker because they don't know just like how twisted they are. And the reason you might get bought in is because they sound very neutral and because they come from a neutral place, right? So there is so much that Critical Drinker does talk about. One of the things is yearning for the men of old Hollywood.
The traditional heroic male lead that was pretty much the bedrock foundation of cinema for almost 100 years is apparently no longer a viable commodity in entertainment today.
The idea is that previously there were better male characters for men to be able to look towards, and the male characters that exist nowadays aren't really aspirational. They don't embody the qualities that typical men that good, mature men would want to be.
Men in movies and TV shows now tend to come across as annoyingly talkative and expressive, reacting emotionally to what other people say and do, instead of coolly observant and keeping their own feelings in check.
Whether or not, you want to agree with that ideation, there are so many complexities to have to unearth why this argument is so stupid. It seems like something you might be able to agree with, but I kid you not, and I really can't even get into explaining how this is like the lowest common denominator argument for almost any social issue that you want to argue for. And I would say that anyone who does want to like sociologically make argumentation for changes to society or communities, please do not say that we used to have better things and we should go back to that, because there's a long history of it and we're going to dive into it. So the thing that's happening with Critical Drinker is he's making an appeal to tradition.
The traditional heroic male lead.
Right? So the idea would be like a return to tradition. And again, like I said, there is a long history of these types of arguments being made about how current society is either immoral or ineffectual in meeting the needs of its people as compared to previous societies.
Men in movies and TV shows now tend to come across as annoyingly talkative and expressive. We have to make him sad and pouty and hung up on a woman who died like 4 movies ago. And when he tries to flirt with women now, it becomes a point of awkward comedy because gosh darn it, why on earth would they be attracted to a man like him? Yep, that's what I want. I want to be laughing at James Bond.
And for the most part, this is a very neutral statement, right? Because you're not saying any one group of people is responsible for this, right? The Critical Drinker's argument is that in Hollywood, it is Hollywood executives, people who control Hollywood, script writers, directors, producers, or all that, who hate men.
Men, don't you just hate them all? Well, if you happen to be a creative working in Hollywood today, then the answer is probably yeah.
Yes, his voice does sound like that the entire time.
And who want you to hate men and are actively creating fictions and stories where you are going to look at the men on screen and go, oh, I really dislike them, and therefore I'm going to actually like women more. There's a whole section of his video where he talks about men basically need to have a more popular, smarter, more charismatic woman to their side in order to make up for their dumbness or how they're really not perceived to be aspirational. And when you juxtapose masculinity versus femininity like this, it becomes a little bit easier to, I think, deconstruct and to see if there's anything going on. And the funny thing is, I don't even know if the Critical Drinker is actively a sexist. Like I don't know him well enough to be able to say that. But I think if he isn't an active sexist, I think he may be falling into sexist argumentations and tropes. And again, it's really easy to do that, funny enough, because they're hidden as neutral commentary on things. So I'll give you guys an example of how there has always been an appeal to returning to tradition. And when I say return to tradition, what I mean is that people in a modern age think that something in our past, some type of action, some type of community basis, some type of way of culture is superior to what we have now. And this can be done in 2 ways. One is that you actively praise the previous culture, right? So you say like, we used to be really great.
The traditional heroic male lead that was pretty much the bedrock foundation of cinema.
There's another way that is a bit more innocuous, and it is to denigrate or like insult, bring down the current generation, right? And you make a moral statement or an ethical statement about their behavior, their attitudes, how they treat people.
Men in movies and TV shows now tend to come across as annoyingly talkative and expressive.
We have heard this time and time again from all sorts of people about things that just happen in a modern day context. One of the big ones is video games. People for literally decades have talked about how, video games have poisoned the minds of young men, or just people in general, but a lot of times it's for men. And that generations that didn't have video games didn't have to deal with these type of social pressures.
But the idea of these video games to dehumanize individuals, to have a game of shooting individuals and others, I've always felt that is a problem for future generations and others.
They say that pornography, has caused a mass degradation of morality.
Black, who is running for Tennessee governor, blamed the increase in school shootings on deterioration of the family, violent movies, and pornography.
And they said this about, like rock and roll too, that rock and roll would cause people to become socially tainted, morally degraded. They listened to this type of non-restrained music.
Percussion, music generally, bypasses the rational faculties.
Right.
And
Yes.
This is why Plato said
Yes.
you got to watch out. This is why Alan Bloom said don't listen to rock music.
Right.
And metal, by taking out discipline and control and melody and harmony for that matter, and by being entirely percussive, I do think, I'm with the old fuddy-duddies going back to Plato, I think it arouses the base passions and is actually not ever edifying.
And again, it's like maybe even now you're starting to see a little bit of what I'm talking about, but it's every generation thinks that something happening, either with art, cultural expression, acceptance, is going to degrade them, to make them lesser from what they were before. Here's, and again, I was going to get to this, a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So you're going to have to forgive me because I can't really find citations for any of these things. I'm going to assume that they're real because it makes my point more valid. But in all seriousness, a lot of these are sayings that are recorded from people who are talking about teenagers in their current day, right? This is the one that I initially heard of, and then I just happened to find this page. We live in a decaying age. Young people no longer respect their parents. They are rude and impatient. They frequently inhabit taverns and have no self-control. Inscription, 6,000-year-old Egyptian tomb. And the idea is that, so many people think that teenagers, that just individuals in general, as society progresses and becomes more egalitarian, more accepting, more immoral, that we are becoming worse and worse from some type of high standard that existed in the past. But the funny thing is, again, every generation thinks that way. This is 6,000 years old, and the Egyptians are complaining that oh, young people these days, this current generation, they are the bad people. My generation, the previous generations, we were the moral ones, we were the good ones. And of course, the logic in here to think about is that of course you're gonna think your generation is the good generation. Of course you're gonna look back with rose-colored glasses to view the time that created you, informed you as the good time. But that's what everyone does. That's literally what all people do forever, right? You want to lionize what made you you and the time that made you you, and you want to find people to be angry at for things not being the way that you might want them, and oftentimes it's young people. I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on frivolous youth of today, or certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. When I was young, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of elders, but the present youth are exceedingly wise, disrespectful, and impatient of restraint. Right, so this is from the 8th century. It's the idea that there would be some great moral failing from something uniquely bad happening today with the current young people that we didn't have to deal with. We were taught respect. And there's way more from Plato, Socrates, Seneca, all these type of things. And the reason that I bring up these specific types of quotes, and again, you can pause and read them if you want, is because I think they lead into another really big point that we'll get to in a little bit. But one thing I did want to say is that these argue for a return to tradition, right? So remember, the way that I talked about it before was that you can either return to tradition and make an argument for returning to tradition through praising the past, or you make an argument to return to tradition by denigrating the present, right? By making fun of it, by saying this actually isn't good. And again, this seems really neutral in the moment because you're not blaming anyone. Well, I mean, these people they're blaming teenagers, but you're not truly blaming a specific group most of the time for this type of thing. Where this gets insidious though, is that oftentimes a return to tradition, unfortunately, means returning back to a time where a certain group of people had power and privilege and another group of people was under them as an underclass. And I sincerely believe that a lot of people who argue in a modern day context for a return to tradition aren't actual sexists and racists in an active mindset like a Klan member would be, but they don't realize that the thing that they're actively kind of preaching for not only wouldn't be good for them, but wouldn't be good for so many other groups of people. If we want to stick to just fiction, what the critical drinker, I think, gets wrong, and what so many people get wrong about returning to tradition, is that times were just as bad, if not worse than what we have now, right? That's the fallacy. I'm sorry, Hollywood in general, for as much as I complain about it, and I complain a lot, like a lot of people do, but like Hollywood in general is so much better than the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Like just objectively better. I think people look back and they find Gone with the Wind, Citizen Kane, The Godfather, movies that are like landmark from the time, Omen, Alien, Star Wars, all that kind of stuff from the mid and late 20th century. And they go, we really used to make good movies. We used to have Kurosawa films. Like, we used to be able to have like real art on the screen, real expressions of things. Look at all these movies that I could tell you from. And the fallacy here is that like, well, yeah, there were good movies in the 20th century, undoubtedly so, but not every movie was a good movie. You are having a bit of selection bias, because what you're trying to select for, especially if you're looking for like male figures that are really engaging and saying that, oh, the 20th century used to have like these really powerful, enthralling male figures that we like aspire to. There were tons of male figures in the 20th century that you wouldn't aspire to, right? Like, and tons of movies that weren't good. You only remember the movies that are worth remembering, and you forget the movies that aren't. And what that does is cause you to have your entire view of posterity, of tradition, be positive. Because right now, you can't forget the bad things. They're happening to you now. But if you didn't live back then, if all you're hearing about the things that stood the test of time, of course you're gonna think those things are better. But that's not how any of this works. And again, Man Caring Thing like points this out, that the Critical Drinker has like no real conception of what Hollywood was like and the things that he's preaching to return to.
Richard Burton, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando. I mean, you got cool shots of guys being guys, yeah, but these are not examples of the heroic male lead that he's talking about. These are method actors of the 50s and 60s. Like Montgomery Clift, he was known for his complex, troubled characters. He was gay. Marlon Brando, I mean, these guys broke the mold of acting in general. So to our eyes today, yeah, they look like manly men when you show a second of their performances. But for their time period, they were dangerous, sexual screen presences, deeply psychological, and very, very emotional.
Because it's all vibes based, guys. Like, that's the thing to think about. It's just vibes. They want to return back to a time that they feel is better, but without thinking about any of it. And when I talked about people being unwitting sexists and racists, this was like a time when, like, if we're talking specifically about Hollywood, when the Hays Code was still a thing. I've talked about this in previous videos on my channel, where you couldn't show like a married couple sleeping in the same bed because it was thought to be immoral. You couldn't show like drug use on screen because it was thought to be immoral. You couldn't show interracial relationships on screen because it was thought to be immoral, right? Like, women almost exclusively were depicted as like housewives or secretaries. And we couldn't get stories of like really cool leading female characters, at least not in like a widespread sense. There were so many worse restrictions for Hollywood and just the culture back in the 20th century that took decades and decades and decades to fight against to get to the point where we are now, right? And I'm not even going to talk about special effects or like the multitude of different new IPs that have come up that have become like huge, stories that would have never been able to been told. But if we literally just think about like the types of social commentary that Hollywood was willing to tell back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it's just, again, objectively better now because there is so much more freedom and acceptance for different types of stories, for different types of men to be exemplified on screen, for different types of women to be exemplified on screen. Because every man is different, every woman is different, and every man who has to interact with women is going to have a different interaction with it. And every woman who interacts with a man is going to have a different interaction with masculinity, right? It's the multifaceted nature of modern fiction that I think has created such a focus on it. Because before, when it was more restricted in this imaginary place that the Critical Drinker wants to return to, there was very strict control over what got to be presented. And I'm gonna be so real, the reason that I think it's vibes based and the reason why so many men might be uncomfortable with the modern depiction of men in fiction is because men generally just like weren't really challenged on screen that much by non-men, right? Like, if you think back to like the 20th century movies, almost everyone in leading roles were men, and the other people who were challenging them on their behavior, or maybe even reinforcing their behavior, were men. And the only times, for the most part, women had any real say in men's behavior or actions was through marriage and being shamed, right? Like, women would have to be hurt or be made into damsels, or they would have to die, or they'd have to be cheated on and cause guilt and shame in a man through his own actions and the agency that he had in order to have an effect on men.
I want you to forgive me.
For what?
Everything.
But for the most part, it was men being in positions of leadership and power and control and authority being changed by other men. And that feels relatively safe, right? Because it's an in-group. And the thing that I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with now is that modern fiction has men being challenged by multitudes of different people. Sometimes it's freaking children, right? Like it could be women, old people, freaking animals, aliens. It seems, I would say, for a person who is confided in the idea of the 20th century being a time where kind of like men were able to be unapologetically men and deal with our issues on our own, it would be very uncomfortable for them to have to watch so many men nowadays share authority and spotlight and their journey of masculinity with a bunch of non-men. And I would say, of course, like, if you are generally uncomfortable with the idea of men being investigated and not being traditionally masculine, maybe that's an investigation that you have to do about your own journey with masculinity. But what the Critical Drinker, I think, argues for, wrongly, as Man Caring Thing points out, is this return to a time that he doesn't even understand and that wouldn't even be good for him, right? Like, the 20th century wasn't good for men. Like, it was pretty bad, and we can all agree to that. But again, it's the rose-colored glasses. And this does lead us into, I think, a dissection of how the return to tradition, even said neutrally, when you do even a little bit of investigating and you go like, okay, well, what would it actually be like for us to return to the time where these things happened? It wouldn't be good for anybody. And that leads us to why I even brought up these quotes in the first place.
Hi, everybody. You should subscribe and listen to him talk more and buy his books. Thank you.
Yeah, so these quotes here are from ancient philosophers. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand about the Critical Drinker is his advocacy for Stoic men.
The death of the Stoic man. Think about the subtle shifts of power and dominance as their scenes progress. The use of pauses and facial expressions and eye contact. A Stoic character is one that's generally reserved and emotionally distant. The kind of person who bears their troubles and discomforts without too much complaining.
So he compares the cool masculinity from back then to the fragile masculinity of today.
The men in movies and TV shows now tend to come across as annoyingly talkative and expressive.
Now, Stoic men, and I'm only laughing because it's so ridiculous. So there has been a recent surge in the idea about men adopting positions of Stoicism.
Today, all over the world, young men, they're struggling, they're angry, they're uncertain. They desperately need a guide to the good life. So now, as then, Stoicism can serve as this guide.
It's men being reserved, be having control of their emotions, or not feeling emotions as deeply. And it's to remain logical and clear-sighted, and to make good decisions and not to be affected, and to be able to do your work. And Stoicism isn't just about maintaining control of your emotions, as so many men think it is. Stoicism is like a whole belief in philosophy system from like the Hellenistic era. It is not simply just like, oh, I don't want to feel things, or I don't feel things as deeply. It was a actual method and lifestyle that ancient philosophers and men and women did. And this is the thing that with the Critical Drinker preaching Stoicism that can get really confusing and really stupid to people who don't know the background of it. So this is, I think, maybe the heart and core of why the Critical Drinker himself can't even make these arguments, and how Man Caring Things like points them out, because they're like contradictory. I mean, even Man-Carrying Thing literally says this about the video.
Or how about Superman? Surely one of the most long-standing examples of the strong, square-jawed, patriotic male superhero. Well, not in the mind of Zack Snyder, who transformed him into a sullen, brooding, conflicted outsider who doesn't even know if he can or should help humanity in any way.
Zack Snyder's Superman fits the perfect definition of a stoic male hero, but the critical drinker probably just doesn't like that movie for some reason, and he's like, no, that's actually a bad example. He wasn't being stoic in the right way. And that's like... this is my favorite part about this. It's not just a couple times. The whole video is like that. It just keeps happening over and over again, so that if you have any understanding of the history of movies or Hollywood in general, the video cancels itself out. It neutralizes itself.
Stoicism is largely predicated on logic. In fact, it's like the central tenet of the entire philosophical idea. It's to achieve a happy life, a life worth living, requires logical thought. The Stoics held that an understanding of ethics was impossible without logic. So, right, so like the core of how Stoics, who were mainly men, how they would deal with the world is through logical reasoning. And the way to have a truly stoic life and to be able to have a command of logical reasoning is to separate your emotions from the logic, right? Because the idea is that the more emotional you get about something, the less logical and the less objective you'll be able to be about those decisions. And the less objective you're about decisions you make in your life, the less control you have over your life. And Stoicism, I would say, in defense of it, was probably really good exploratively for its time, because there were a lot of men in a lot of positions who dealt with a lot of very emotional things that probably would have derailed their entire lives if they were not able to work through them in a reserved, stoic way. Stoicism is useless nowadays. There's no reason for Stoicism, but I'm even getting ahead of myself. The thing that Critical Drinker talks about in Man-Carrying Thing directly addresses it is that it seems the Critical Drinker thinks that men innately feel less things than people think, and by assumption, feel less things than women. Because I think he literally says, like, men just feel things less deeply than people assume.
The reality is that most of the time, men just don't feel things as deeply as people seem to imagine. They don't tend to get hung up on things in the same way that other people do. They don't constantly fret and worry over trivial problems.
And it would seem that the Critical Drinker's obsession with Stoicism and wanting to see stoic men comes from a reverse engineering of why Stoicism is good. And I do agree with Man-Carrying Thing that if the Critical Drinker thinks this way, it's a sad existence. If he actually thinks like, oh, I just have less emotions, I feel things less deeply, that's a sad way to live. But also, he may actually think, as a man, this is just how men live. And if I feel this way, I need to have a reason to validate it. So I'm going to want to be like stoic men, because I already am emotionally walled off and bereft of being able to explore myself in a deep and genuine way, which is why he cares so deeply about Stoics and men being Stoics, which is also funny because at the end of the day, it really isn't about men being stoic. It's about men being in fictions in a way that the Critical Drinker likes. Because this isn't about logic. That's the funniest thing about all this stuff. Stoicism would not agree with many of the positions that the Critical Drinker holds about masculinity. Because so many of the things that like the Critical Drinker argues for are contradictory with themselves.
They're too dated, too toxic, too dangerous to put into the limelight. And so they've been replaced with more acceptable alternatives.
What is this image? Like, Pattinson as Batman is intimidating and stoic. Everything he says that he wants.
Robert Pattinson being Batman and being stoic, but also apparently not being the right stoic, is a very emotional move. Like that's a very, as he would probably think, a womanly way of thinking about things. And if he were actually using logic as Stoicism would dictate, he would probably have to move back and say, yeah, even though I didn't enjoy the performance, and even though maybe I didn't like the movie, I'm not going to argue that Robert Pattinson's Batman wasn't exactly what I'm arguing for. He should be able to do both and hold both. But there are a lot of people who consume fiction, who make commentaries on fiction, who literally think, like a child, that if I don't like this thing, it must be bad. Which is crazy, because like I feel like one of the most important parts of having any type of like nuanced, in-depth conversation about fiction is being able to objectively assess the fiction regardless of how your personal opinions align on it, right? Like I can say that freaking Aquaman 1 is a terrible dumpster fire movie. I've said it 1,000 times and I'll say it 1,000 times again, but it is super fun. It's a wonderfully produced visual journey of bumbling idiots and horrible actors who don't know what they're doing. But just because I like it, I'm not going to praise it for excellent dialogue and like scene construction and all that kind of stuff. But this is I think the problem is people who praise Stoicism because they know nothing about actually being a Stoic and aren't investigative about what Stoicism actually entails, which is lengthy, by the way. Like, it is, again, an entire belief system. It is a way of life. It has argumentations. There's a lot that went into Stoicism that they don't actually have a way of defining what they think. And the other part of it goes to a lot of men will innately think that Stoicism is a part of masculinity because men are naturally, again, less emotionally inclined. And the flip side to that obviously would be that women are more emotionally inclined.
The reality is that most of the time, men just don't feel things as deeply as people seem to imagine. They don't tend to get hung up on things in the same way that other people do.
And men stick onto Stoicism, or I should say a lot of the people who are interested in Stoicism stick onto it because they think it is an exclusively masculine idea. They think like, oh, I can be validated in my pure emotional uninvestigation of myself. There's an entire, like lauded like school of thought for me to just be like an emotional brick wall. That's great. And women aren't like this because women are innately emotional, and I could just be around other people who validate my existence of just walking through the world like a husk without having to like investigate myself. Awesome. But the problem is, of course, there were women Stoics. Stoicism is not unique to masculinity. There are famous women Stoics. If you just Google, could women be Stoics? There's just whole articles written about, famous female Stoics. Because the idea that women are innately more emotional, that women are innately less stoic, less logical, is sexist. And it creates an easy way for men to escape even having to interact with femininity because they think there's no reason to interact with it because it's not based in logic. I'm based in logic as a masculine stoic man, and therefore I could just kind of like stand on my hill and look down at all the women who are complaining about their circumstances and write it off as like people who don't really even understand their own plight and how good they really have it in my system. And again, this goes back to a return to tradition, because now women and a bunch of other people actively understand that there is inequality in the world, that there is mistreatment, that they are entitled to better treatment, that they have access to better treatments and outcomes. But before, women were very happy to just be housewives. They were very okay with not being able to have their own bank account, or not being able to buy property, or not being able to have a credit card, or not being able to have an individual life insurance policy, or not being able to have a driver's license, or not being able to vote, right? Because they accepted those things as a part of the social fabric. And what a return to tradition, even if you're arguing just for fiction, kind of also argues for, is a return to moments in time where those fictions would have been validated by the society around them, which is crazy, because in the same breath, which is how unstoic and how unlogical many of these arguments, including the one Critical Drinker makes, is that he actually doesn't even want to return to tradition because he doesn't even have a defined timeline or a set of fictions that he thinks is an encapsulation of what he really wants.
Hard as it may be to believe now, there was a time when we were practically spoiled for choice when it came to cool, awesome, aspirational male heroes on the big and the small screen.
Iron Man, Superman, Batman, Deadpool? Deadpool came out in 2016. Is the nostalgic time we're looking back to so recent? Have we degraded men so much since then?
There's a whole section of the video where he laments that modern men are dumb, stupid, ineffectual, have to be propped up by femininity. And he references, strangely, Chris Hemsworth in the remake of the Ghostbusters from 2016, and then just the general concept of commercials.
Don't believe me? Fuck it, go turn on your TV and watch basically any commercial break that comes up in the next hour or so. Tell me, how many dumb, hapless, incompetent husbands, fathers, and boyfriends do you see constantly screwing up even the most simple household tasks and needing someone more diverse to bail them out?
Which, again, is wild to me, but the idea that he's making is that, like, nowadays, in modern fiction, men are only kind of perceived as being dumb and needing women to prop them up. Where before, men were leading, men were authoritative, men were independent, men could accomplish things on their own, men were smart, they were logical, which is crazy. Because there are whole genres of fiction defined by dumb, stupid men that have gone back for like decades. Like literally just off the top of my head, Homer Simpson, Timmy Turner's dad, Hugh Neutron, and Peter Griffin are all morons. And those shows now are like 20 to 30 years old. And it's the trope of the sometimes fat, but always dumb man who overachieves and finds the mostly beautiful but competent wife. And that type of stuff has been happening literally for as long as I've been alive. And even before that, there were dozens of shows that had middle-aged, let's be real, kind of busted out, ugly men who were with, at the time, nagging housewives who had to like do everything for them. This goes back to like the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, right? Like women in media have almost always been depicted as the balancing act for the more ludicrous nature of the men in said fictions.
No, that's offensive. You can't pretend to be black. That's a stupid idea.
What?
It's a stupid idea! You're a stupid man! A stupid man!
Ow, you're hurting me!
But this isn't a social commentary about the way that things should be. And even if it wasn't, right? Again, the whole argument is that we need to go back to a time where men were more, like independent. They were never more independent. Men have always shared the space with women and have almost always been depicted as needing the help of women. That's been like a very consistent thing. Freaking I Love Lucy wasn't called I Love Ricky. It was called I Love Lucy. And she had her husband with her in the show and they worked together. But even if it wasn't, the idea of these marriages and these unions being portrayed on the screen actually is, I think, funny enough, where the critical drinker could have like made an argument about misandry, because I do think there is a long-standing history of, I think, hand-waving men to be stupid. But even if you were going to make an argument about misandry and not being investigative about how a man could be self-sufficient and not stupid in a marriage, it kind of falls apart, because the whole point of these shows most of the time, one, where they have caricatures of people, but it wasn't even like the women were painted in a good light either. But again, people who want to return to tradition, they have such a crazy warped view of both masculinity and femininity that while they can properly assess the misandry associated with the representation of men in these fictions, they don't recognize the misogyny represented with the women, because they literally think that the women on screen are just doing what women should be doing in real life. Women should be cooking and cleaning. They should only be concerned with like taking care of the kids. They should only be concerned with making sure like the household is run well, right? They literally think this can't be misogyny because it's just real. Men obviously aren't dumb like on TV, but women really are just like vacuums with boobs. And the issue is that both representations of these types of people in these fictions are wrong for both groups of people. Women can be the breadwinners, men can stay at home, men can take care of the kids. Like we I think pass it off as like an innate part of like older style fictions where it's just like, okay, yeah, like the women stays at home, they're more attractive, they're social butterflies, but like that's not what femininity is innately about. You don't have to be a caretaker or a homemaker if you're a woman. You don't even have to be physically attractive if you're a woman. There's all different types of women. And just in the same way that, again, a bunch of these older style marriages and unions depict men, I think, uncharitably, but stereotypically in their role, because a lot of the times it's supposed to be funny, like get a backbone. They also depict women really, really badly too, because, they didn't have any better frame of reference because it was the freaking like 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and stuff. But we do have a better frame of reference now, which makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And then getting to the final part that I want to talk about, because this is already becoming way too long, is that the critical drinker makes a commentary about how men can't just be smart anymore. Like the most competent, capable person can't be a man. There has to be some type of woman who helps the man in his moment of conflict, because it is just not acceptable anymore to have men be smart and capable.
The message is always the same. Men and everything that they do are stupid, they didn't earn or deserve anything that they actually have, and most of the time they need a smarter, stronger, and better female character to get them on track.
And he argues that previously, again, men were able to do these things. This goes back to the whole like Stoic thing where they think masculinity is innately linked with logic, which it's not. But I find it incredibly ironic because I would say that maybe one of the most iconic and famous male characters in like the last 9 years is Rick Sanchez. Like saying Rick and Morty, even though it's the name of the show, you instantly know. I could probably show you Rick's silhouette and you would know who it is. And Rick is quite literally the smartest being in the universe. Like the idea of arguing that male representation is completely separated from like intelligence or logic is like crazy to me. Paul Atreides and Leto Atreides and the Harkonnens, those are like all dudes and they're all incredibly competent and intelligent. I know someone might say like, but the Bene Gesserit are the secret, you know, like masters of the, and sure, yeah, I'm not saying that there also aren't smart women, but the critical drinkers argument is that smart men in Hollywood have to be side by side with smarter women to validate them. And that's just like, I don't know, like not true. I mean, Lex Luthor has been in fictions consistently for like, what, 60 years? And he pretty much has like always been on his own, like one of the smartest people in the entire like DC universe. I mean, like this is so stupid that I can't even like bring up more off the top of my head because it seems nearly too dumb to have to even argue against. Syndrome had a female companion, but he was the smartest person on the planet from like Incredibles, and Mirage was literally just a pretty face. Like Mirage wasn't doing anything for Syndrome. And this is back in like freaking what, like 2003? And there's consistently been like fictions from the last 20 years that show very capable leading men doing things on their own. But I think to act that there is some mass famine of smart, capable, independent men more goes to the fact that he is more concerned, I think, with being slighted than enjoying what is in front of him, right? And I think a lot of the comments talk about this very well, in that it's very ironic that he talks about he feels things not as strongly as women, you know, that men in general, that men keep control of their emotions, that they're stoic, that they aren't impacted by things a lot, while also having a whole channel comprised about seemingly becoming emotional about stories and like people on a screen that he'll never meet, and not even being good at it. Like he is so focused on like these tiny little slights from his favorite like on-screen stories being not told the way that he is, that he can't even like appreciate like seemingly like all the good stuff that happens, to the point where he has to make like a video about the systemic disenfranchisement of men in Hollywood and why they hate us. And don't get me wrong, there are tons of ways which I could make critical drinkers argument for him. I won't, just like Man Caring Thing won't. But I think Hollywood does depict men in a multitude of unhealthy ways. I literally just made a video about it on like the main channel, but the ways that he talks about are just secret coding to get men to not like non-men. Right? Like that's all it is. That's what this like breaks down to, if we're being honest. All this is ways to have men be angry at the current moment, right? Because there's no remedy for that, right? Like it removes the onus on yourself for improvement. And the argument then becomes you aren't the problem. And really nothing that you can do yourself is the problem. The time we live in is the problem. And we have to change the time we live in to be like the time we used to be. A return to tradition has been used to affect large swaths of people, but men specifically, for like a very, very long time. Like, just to give you guys some examples, like Ronald Reagan back in like the 80s had like "Let's Make America Great Again" slogan. I know a lot of people like think about it in terms of the Trump administration, but "Let's Make America Great Again" is literally saying like, hey, yeah, remember the time before? We should go back to that time. Let's be like how we used to be. We aren't as great as we were, so we should return to that time. We should return to our roots, our traditions of the past. This was 45 years ago when Ronald Reagan did a return to tradition argument. And again, he won like 84 states. So it appealed to a lot of people, but this isn't even like the earliest representation of it. Freaking Germany and Hitler back in like the 30s used "make Germany great again," right? Like a return to the tradition of what Germany was. Like this is like, I mean, just this is obviously what, 60, 70, 80, 90 years of large scale social argumentations for returning to a past time. But obviously the argument becomes, if every time thought their time was bad, why are we trying to return to that time, right? Like if people from the 30s and the 40s and then the 80s are all arguing that the times that they're in are like not as good as the times before, it kind of defeats the purpose of even arguing for going back in time, right? But that's the paradox, is that no time is any less morally degraded or more in tune with ethics innately than any other time, because arguments for returning to tradition are hundreds and hundreds of years old. Again, people were making them 6,000 years ago. It is almost subjective that like nowadays we have much better security, much better outcomes, quality of life, healthcare, food, experiences, multiculturalism. I wouldn't want to go back to these times. And the people that do want to go back to these times are simply unhappy with how they exist in the current times. And they've deluded themselves into thinking that it's the times themselves that they're angry with instead of themselves. And I think that's the big issue with having to tie in fiction to any of this, because it's not an understanding of fiction that would bring you to these ideations. It's a misunderstanding of yourself. And even though I know Jake, Man Caring Things, didn't want to devote 50 minutes to this like I did, these are the thoughts that I had when watching his response to Critical Drinker, because I truly do care about young men, or just men in general, feeling happy and safe and healthy in this time of, I think, of extreme social and gender-based animosity and confusion when it comes to how to like properly live your life. But videos like his, like the Critical Drinkers, I think only works to like confuse and lead men astray into not, I think, being self-investigative, to being emotional, to looking to interact with femininity in ways that can make their masculinity more certain. And I think that's a real tragedy. So I wanted to be able to make this video, and hopefully you guys learned something from it, because Lord have mercy, that original video did not deserve 3 million views. So anyway, like, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff, twist, dance around, bounce on it, whatever. I'll probably make more videos about stuff like this in the future, and see you guys later.